So he said, who's even suing me? Like, I know where I'm being sued, but who is even suing me? How did these lawsuits come about? And what's my risk? So there's basically two ways that a lawsuit can come about. The first is a person with a disability goes to your website and they're not able to access it as you intend them to access it, right? They're not having the same experience as anyone else who goes there. So perhaps it's not screen reader compatible, it doesn't have keyboard controls, it doesn't have contrast, so they can't actually see the text that you put into the graphics, etc. Or it's confusing or in some other way in violation. They go contact a lawyer and they file a lawsuit, right? Now, I will say something on this topic because I actually fall into this category. Those of you who know me might know this, but I was born blind or functionally blind. And so I'm very fortunate in that there was corrective surgery avenues that were able to give me vision. But as somebody who has struggled my entire life, just because technology emerged when I was a kid, the internet was born when I was a child or later in my teens, I guess, when it became popular. I really appreciate that we're now taking this a little more seriously, but it is not every disabled person who can't access your website that goes out and files a lawsuit. I don't want to give anybody that impression that, they look at it and they automatically call a lawyer. That's not what's happening. But that is one scenario where someone may file a lawsuit. The second is, unfortunately, with every good intentioned thing, there's a bunch of bad actors that show up. Right? So because the majority of websites aren't compliant, and we know this, right? And because the information rollout around this wasn't particularly well done, right? I know about this because I work in technology, but you may be hearing about this for the first time. And I work with lots of businesses who work in the marketing space, and this information was not rolled out particularly well. I don't even remember the rollout, honestly, by the ADA or by the federal government on this. So because it wasn't rolled out well, and we know the majority of websites are not compliant, it's low-hanging fruit. Those of you who love stats like me, I'll put some stats below, but we are seeing ADA lawsuits definitely on the rise. They've been gaining traction year over year for the last 3 years, since about 2017, when this became a much more enforceable, or something that was much easier to enforce within the courts.
So now that we know where lawsuits come from, one of the biggest things you'll want to do is assess your risk. Because all of that information is great, how does it apply to you, right? So in order to do that, I think it's easiest to take a little walk back through time. In 2017, Winn-Dixie, which is a grocery and pharmacy retailer, was the first case that was ever brought for ADA non-compliance. So in that case, Winn-Dixie was ordered to update its website. They said it is inaccessible to a blind visitor. Go ahead, get that updated. There was no fines actually issued in that case. But then later that year in 2017, the lawyer went back to court. That same plaintiff went back to court, and they were actually awarded $100,000 in damages, and Winn-Dixie appealed that, and I think eventually they ended up settling out of court. So if we're ever looking for truly a patient zero, they were the first lawsuit of their kind. But what happened is, not only did that change the law in the US, it also set the precedent that this is a winnable case. In 2017, Domino's was sued, and they were the first major food and beverage company to be sued, and they also decided that they were going to fight the lawsuit. But because it had already been proven with Winn-Dixie, on the heels of the Domino's lawsuit, other food and beverage companies started being sued as well. Starbucks, Burger King, McDonald's, they all received lawsuits. They all settled out of court. Domino's was prepared to go the distance. The other companies said, you know what, we'll admit our fault, or we'll admit that we've got room to improve here. Maybe not fault, but we'll admit we've got room to improve here, and we'll go ahead and settle out of court and just get on with it and update our site. Then we saw other retailers like Amazon and Target, which were sort of the first two in the big retail space that got sued. Again, they settled out of court and agreed to make changes to make accessibility a priority. We also saw every major hotel chain in the US, Hilton, Marriott, IHG, Choice Rewards, even Airbnb, all settled out of court because they knew it was easier than fighting it. We saw that YouTube, if you remember back in 2018, I think it was, when YouTube introduced automatic captioning for every video, it is because of this law that they did that. We also saw Netflix, CNN, Fox, Disney, and Pornhub, which you'll probably never hear all of those companies in the same category, but they also all settled out of court, as well as some large healthcare providers and insurance companies. So what we saw from 2017 to 2019 was that the big players in those spaces, in these specific spaces, and there are tons more, of course, these are just some of the more high profile ones, they all received and they acknowledged, yes, this law is valid, and yes, we need to do better. If you remember Domino's didn't settle. They said, we are going the distance on this, and had it worked out, they would have been the heroes of the food and beverage industry and may have prevented a lot of lawsuits going forward. But in 2019, they lost. And so what that did is it reinforced that, yes, this law needs to apply. I'm sure when physical disability laws came in years and years ago, I think it was back in the 50s, we had this same problem. This just moved a lot faster because of the advancement of technology. So these big companies that got sued and that settled out of court, and they may have also received demand letters. None of these ones did. They all had lawsuits, but larger companies that received demand letters as well, they said, let's just deal with this. Let's acknowledge this is now required, and let's move on to actually getting our sites updated so they're accessible for everyone. So obviously those industries are high risk, but here, according to Small Business Association, here are the 14 most sued industries for ADA non-compliance. Travel and hospitality. We saw all the major chains settle out of court and acknowledge that they needed to do better on accessibility, but now downstream of that, there are individual hotels, whether they are branded or non-branded, and this opened the floodgates on all of those hotels, as well as a lot in the travel space. I believe American Airlines and United also both settled out of court. The restaurant and food services, and this became really important during COVID. The only way to order was online, and we saw just reams and reams of lawsuits and demand letters that went out to these small and large restaurant and food services. And during COVID, in some ways, that was the only way to get food from a restaurant. I suppose you could phone as well, but a lot of places even cut their phone staff out because they just did not have the budget to keep someone around answering the phones. So it was very important that those changes were made before COVID, and then during COVID, we saw a ton of companies receive lawsuits and demand letters. Health and medical, even more important during COVID, right? People needed access to healthcare. Again, a lot of this was pushed forward, probably 5 to 10 years because of COVID. The law existed, but all of a sudden we saw people, 20% of the population of the US that was not able to access sites, and that brought on many additional lawsuits. E-commerce, we saw Amazon back in, I think it was 2018, that had the original lawsuit, but thankfully their sites and services were updated so that people of all abilities levels were actually able to order product during COVID. But e-commerce, again, the only way for someone to access your business is through a website. It has to be compliant. You are at huge risk, and you want to get on that like today, if that's the only way for someone to access your business. Universities and educational institutions brought forward also because of COVID, right? All learning moved online. So there were previously educational institutions or universities and colleges that were predominantly online, and they were heavy targets. But this opened it up to everyone who was teaching online. It had to be accessible. You can't have 20% of the population of the folks that need to use your service not available to access it because it's not accessible. The beauty, fitness, and wellness industry, Fenty Beauty settled out of court a couple of years ago, and this really opened up that space. I was surprised it ranked so high on the list. These are just the stats from the Small Business Association. So I was surprised it ranked so high on the list, but I suppose because there are so many independent retailers and independent fitness facilities, it's a very, very large market, and that's why we're seeing so many of those lawsuits. The entertainment space, we saw all the big guys, right? All of the big guys were sued. And so this also reinforced that this is a space that has to be accessible. Your clientele cannot access your business because it's not accessible. So because of those wins, we saw a lot more in the entertainment space as well. Insurance, again, pushed forward because of COVID. Companies kept back staff. They didn't have people, or people didn't want to sit on the phone for 2 hours to wait to talk to somebody. They needed to be able to access their information online. And in order to do that, the site had to be accessible. So we've seen a lot of lawsuits in that space as well. The major players in that space, Allstate, Progressive, Farmers, I believe, have all settled out of court, but every single one of those has thousands, tens of thousands of independent resellers or independent insurance agents, and those folks are huge targets of lawsuits. retail stores, anything brick and mortar, which actually kind of dropped, I think, in some ways during COVID if you weren't in one of these other categories because your business was closed. It was closed to everybody. So a lot of those businesses weren't still functioning. That's what probably keeps it down. You know, it's down a little bit lower on the list because of that. Previously, they had been massive targets. Home services, we saw Home Depot settle out of court. Target kind of falls into that home services space as well. Again, if we advertise that the best way to reach us as a business is online, those sites have to be compliant, and those are proven hot markets. The lawsuits and demand letters tend to come in waves, right? Once one industry is proven hot, you just get waves and waves of those lawsuits and demand letters following. Banking and financial, we saw Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all settle out of court. And what that did is it opened it up to other financial institutions, including brokerages, to say this market is something also where you need to be accessible. This is how your clients access your business. It needs to be accessible. In fact, the credit union associations throughout the country actually issued notices to all of their credit unions saying, we are a huge target. You're going to want to get on this right away. So if you're in the banking or finance space, definitely something that you're going to want to check into. Real estate. This is interesting because it's the intersection of the Fair Housing Act and accessibility. So this is merging of two very large federal compliance requirements. And so if you're in the real estate space, a lot of that, you know, we see that kind of crossover with hospitality because that is providing rooming to folks. If you're in that space, it's definitely something you're going to want to check with your tech folks and marketing folks about. Automotive, this one kind of surprised me because I didn't realize how many people would be looking online for car purchases, actual purchases, a lot of kind of digital tire kickers, but there were a number of lawsuits filed against specific dealerships that were very large in the industry, and that just has the trickle-down effect of making everything below it a target. So it's also one of the highest targeted industries. And finally, government. This is kind of not surprising, I guess, but a little bit disappointing. They're the ones who came up with the rules. They're the ones who are focusing on inclusivity. And unfortunately, they just haven't been able to keep up with their own rules. But this also extends to government contractors. So if you are a business that exclusively serves government, this applies to you as well. So if you are in any of these spaces, you are going to want to make compliance a priority. It's required for every business in the US, but if you're in one of these spaces, you are a heavy target, meaning if you haven't received your lawsuit or demand letter yet, it's probably getting close to being on its way. So as you're assessing risk, because that's really the question it all boils down to, right, is what's your risk? If you're assessing your risk and you're in one of these 14 categories, you are going to want to make compliance a very high priority.
This video is part of an ongoing series to demystify ADA compliance. So if you would like to see the next video in this series, go ahead and click subscribe to be notified as soon as it's released. And you might also want to check out these videos popping up around you here. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.